right, welcome back. You're listening to Podcasting on a Plane. And if you got here by accident, this is the podcast where we share the backstory between all that we do in air world, be it on the ATC side, the flying side, or whatever else. My name is Brandon Gonzalez. I'm a pilot, air traffic controller, former aircraft salesman, plane crash survivor, CFI, and a bunch of other stuff. We don't need to get into that now, but the important thing is we're broadcasting live, as usual, from West Coast Delta here in California, where the weather's good and everything else, well, we don't need to get into that here. But today's cool, and it's a sort of a ray of hope, a ray of happiness, at least for me, because I get to do one of my absolute favorite things in this episode, and that is share listener feedback. I got a whole bunch of it today, and one of them even leads us to an Airfax Journal story, which, if you've been listening to the podcast for any amount of time, you know how much of a fan I am of Airfax and the late Dick Collins. So I hope you're as excited as I am. Don't go away. I want to start with some listener feedback I got in the form of an email from patron Russ Irwin. And it's about that episode I did with Pam from McKinney. And he says, Brandon, I listened to about half of the Pam episode today, and I wanted to relate a couple of things for your consideration. Number one, I did my primary training at San Carlos Airport, which is a contract tower squeezed in between the San Francisco Bravo and Palo Alto Deltas. And it has a lot of student pilots with two very active clubs and training facilities and a short runway, 2,600 feet. There could easily be 6 or 7 planes in the pattern mixed in with Surf Air PC-12s and various transient GA planes as the closest GA airport to San Francisco. And there were 3 controllers who stood out. A woman, she was a supervisor, and she was great on the radio, crisp, clear, compassionate, and kept an orderly pattern. A guy nicknamed Sleepy because he had almost a completely monotone delivery, so calm, but so on top of everything. While he was in the tower, you just felt soothed and calm, like no harm could come to you. Just follow his simple instructions like extend our downwind, I'll call your base, and all was good in the neighborhood. And then there was Dr. Panic. He was the opposite of Sleepy. His voice made you feel that we were always just one false move away from several mid-airs, busting Bravo, and forcing go-arounds. His favorite word was expedite, which he liked to issue in mid-flare. So I bring this up because Sleepy, he departed, and I was told he went to Truckee when it became towered a few years ago. I had occasion to fly to Truckee earlier this year, and sure enough, there he was. And when I called the tower, I learned his name was actually Steve. No idea what his last name is or any of his story, but he's got to be one of the best in the West for sure. He's just the kind of guy who brings calm to an airspace and makes everyone feel safe and secure. He's perfect for Truckee, which has a lot of weather and a crazy mix of private jets, turboprops, and piston singles. Now regarding Pam's comments about crippling a student, here's another story. I came to flying later in life, and I brought a fair amount of belief in myself, which was fortunate for the situation. A lot of GA traffic in and out of San Carlos and Palo Alto funnels through the Sunol Pass, which is quite narrow and is tucked below the approach to Oakland. CFIs are always on edge going through there, and I had more than one yank of the yoke into a steep bank or dive when they perceived a threat. You usually get at least 3 frequency changes in about a 10 nautical mile distance from the tower, the first to NorCal, then another NorCal while flying low over the bay, and then to be under the Bravo to Oakland Charlie, and even in the Hayward Delta while staying clear of Livermore Delta, which gets a lot of instrument practice approaches. At the end of one of my early cross-country solos, I was returning through the Sunol Gap on flight following, and this woman controller decided I hadn't followed her instruction to descend and maintain. Right there, going through the gap, she ripped me apart on frequency. I was going to Palo Alto that day, and sure enough, when I landed, the tower gave me a phone number to call. I was terrified. I shut down and I made the call from the cockpit. The woman supervisor answered, thanked me, and said she'd need about 20 minutes to review the tapes. I cleaned up the plane, dropped off the keys at the club, and then I went out to my car. The supervisor called me, and the first thing she said was, I'd like to apologize. What a relief. For the next 5 minutes, she apologized for how I'd been treated. She said the tapes showed that I'd followed the controller's instructions, and I responded by saying I knew it was a tough job with a crazy mix of traffic, and I wasn't offended. Had I been 18 years old, though, that might not have been the case. I might have been really traumatized, as Pam suggested. Russ. Well, Russ, I tell you what, thank you so much for this, and what you experienced sums up exactly what Pam and I were talking about, and it's unfortunate that that happens. Yeah, I know, it is a rough job sometimes. Yeah, it's busy. I work in a pretty congested area too, and I get it. But the thing is, that still doesn't excuse being treated that way, so I'm glad that eventually, after a couple minutes of terror, you were completely absolved and you had done the right thing. Now, a fun fact, I've actually flown a lot around the area you're talking about. I've been to Palo Alto and San Carlos, and actually completed my private pilot's license at San Jose. And then I took my check ride out of Livermore, as you discussed, so I'm well aware of that Sunol Pass and how nasty it can get in there. Anyway, well done, sir. Thank you so much for the email. And I hope that people out there can pick up something from this story, because you're not alone. It probably happens somewhere every day. And at the end of the day, I'm glad you got home safely and, no harm, no foul. And also, the fact that you have some of those best in the West types at your local airports, and then you're even able to kind of follow their career is pretty neat. It just shows what a really small world aviation can be. Next up, we got a fun story from Daniel Sternbergh, and you're going to remember him and Phil from just a couple episodes back. He says, I hope you're doing well, or continuing to do well, or at least getting better. I've been enjoying the recent episodes, and particularly enjoyed Deanna Wallace. As a self-avowed Camp 2 resident, I found her story and attitude really amazing. Yeah, tell me about it, man. Anyway, I had a question for you about something that Phil and I and hundreds of other pilots encountered today. An entire section of Denver Center's high-altitude airspace was simply closed. We got an in-flight amendment to our clearance to take us way north around the closed airspace. And we heard a bunch of other amended clearances being handed out that sounded very much like ours. Cleared direct Muddy Mountain, then direct blah, 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 then rest of route unchanged. And as they steered everyone around the closed sector, one pilot was offered his current flight path, but he had to descend to some altitude in the mid-20s to avoid the deviation way north. I did find something in the center NOTAM that was frankly a little difficult to interpret, and I don't really think I've seen any, quote, ATC services are terminated from such and such till such and such time NOTAMs before. One odd thing was that despite our departure from San Jose being well after 12 Zulu, we still got a clearance that took us through the affected sector, as apparently did all these other flights too. It caught us by surprise, as the NOTAM was buried in the en route NOTAMs in the pre-flight briefing. It was mixed in amongst information about wind farms and firefighting TFRs, and I confess those are 40 pages of notifications that I generally skim through. All right, skip over. Anyway, of course, the result was making the sectors north, and I assume south of the impacted sector, incredibly densely populated. The controllers were having a really tough time handling the increased density of traffic, and just to make it a little extra spicy, there was a segment for turbulence for the entire region, and ride reports at every level, quote, that starts with a 3 or 4, end quote, in the words of one beleaguered controller. And he said that the turbulence averaged moderate and constant, although we encountered and reported a pocket of severe turbulence we experienced at an uncommanded descent greater than 1,300 feet a minute that dropped us several hundred feet from our assigned altitude. I was tempted to ask if anyone knew, quote, why the airspace was closed, but A, the controllers were already pretty busy, and B, I was a little concerned that the reasons for such a closure could be a little more sensitive than anyone would want to discuss on an open frequency. But do you guys get info about the causes that drive something like this? Or at least have internal lore about hunches? It seemed entirely unrelated to the POTUS rally in Omaha, our destination airport, which caused its own set of on-field disruptions even 16 hours after the officials finally allowed the FBO staff to leave their building at 1:45 a.m., once the event was over. Well, Phil, that is actually a great question. I'm going to finish the rest of what you wrote in here, and then we'll get right to it. He also adds that on an entirely unrelated note, the second leg of the flight, Omaha to Teterboro at level 390, had tailwinds in excess of 150 knots and a ground speed that peaked at 593. We're always super happy when our ground speed leads off with a 5, but now we've had a glimpse of what a 6 there might look like. Spoiler alert, it makes the trip from Omaha to Teterboro a pretty darn quick one. All the best from the crew, Daniel. Okay, so to answer your actual question, Daniel, I don't know really a lot about this specific event. Yes, I probably get information in the back that I'm privy to that other people don't, and no, I'm not going to say all that right now. But unless you think it's some greater than it is sort of classified information, it really isn't. So I'll just be kind of general here, but we will get a strip that prints out from the strip printer, just like all the other strips about ground delays and flow control and call for releases and, things like that. And it'll say probably something to the effect of call for release any airplanes that are routed through XYZ center airspace, or should I say ZXX center airspace. Anyway, you can fill in the blank with because of a reason that's general, like staffing, equipment outage, VIP movement, whatever. So we can do some digging and probably find out the specifics, but as far as we're concerned, it's just a general notice, and then, you go from there. And it could have been related to the airborne security entourage that always follows the president wherever he travels. That's no surprise either. And it could be for some other reason. Maybe equipment outage, could be staffing. Again, I don't really know. But in a case like that, I'm guessing it wasn't either of those. Now, when things like that happen, I'm, at least here on the West Coast, far enough away that it might even be hard to figure out whether or not that route is going to go through that center's airspace. I mean, sure, I have a general knowledge of how the national airspace system and Victor Airways look, but I'm not like one of those like Hollywood postal workers that can rattle off the city of any zip code or something like that. Yeah, I know most of the VORs in the left half of the country and things like that. I know that if you're going over Phoenix or Albuquerque, you're going to be in Albuquerque Center. That's, pretty simple. But, those sector maps and airspace coverages of the different centers, they don't always look exactly the way you think they would based on their name. So those things tend to be handled a little further down the line. or if the center is going to try to reroute something that came, or somebody, I should say, that came specifically from my airport, that center would probably just call me directly and issue a reroute and tell me to issue it that way. Fair enough. So unfortunately, I don't have any fun Hollywood-style background classified information I can share with you. But yeah, it does get really busy when things like that happen. And as far as what we know, yeah, we get a little strip that says there's a delay through there, and that's about it. Now, facilities that are closer to there, like for instance at Omaha, I'm sure they have a lot more specific information about what was going on, how, and how they're going to route. But as far as Teterboro or San Jose or West Coast Delta, it would just be a really general thing. Ground delay flights going through here, or expect delays or reroutes. And that's pretty much it. Anyway, thank you so much for the question, Daniel, and also for your support of the show. And hopefully when this is all over, you guys can actually get out of the airplane when you come to the Delta again. And here's a fun one. This one was sent in through the SpeakPipe widget that I always say pops up anytime you visit podcastingonaplane.com right at the end of the show. And when you do, here's what it sounds like.
Hey, Brandon, this is Daniel. I wanted to get your opinion as a controller on something that happened recently. I was visiting New York City, and I wanted to fly the skyline there, so I rented a plane out of Farmingdale, which is a Class Delta on Long Island. We took up an LSA and had a great flight, and on the way back, we were cleared for runway 19. The winds were about 270, 10 gusting 17, so it was a pretty high workload. And there had been a Meridian, which is cleared number 2 behind us. When we got to about 100 feet AGL, and I thought I had the landing made, we were told to go around. There was no explanation, so I did it. And later I asked the CFI, what happened there? And he thought that we had been told to go around because the Meridian behind us was getting too close. Essentially, that they had sent us the slower traffic around for them. And that bothered me because, at an untowered field, the aim is pretty clear that we would have had right away. So I'm wondering, as a controller, is that acceptable to send around slower traffic who was cleared number 1 in favor of faster traffic who was cleared number 2 to land? And also, would it have been okay for me to say unable at that point, given the difficulty of that approach? Love to hear your thoughts, and keep up the great work.
All right, so don't hate me for this, but the true answer to this question is something that I think, at least based on what you've told me, and of course, disclaimer, I wasn't there. I am going to armchair quarterback a little bit, but I'm not going to judge what the guy did because, again, I didn't see it. But this is really just going to come down to a judgment call. And you are a light sport, you said, in this case. He was a Meridian. Those are 2 Category 1 aircraft, which basically means single engines, more or less. It's a little more complicated, but we'll just call it single engine type aircraft. So while they may differ to you and I sort of wildly in performance characteristics, they're both a Cat 1. So for runway separation purposes, there would only need to have been 3,000 feet between you, again, in generality. So the Meridian behind you, I'm not sure why he was catching up to you so fast. I fly those. They're pretty quick, but they're not, it's not a Learjet. You're not approaching it at 130 over the fence or something like that. So what I'm guessing here, I'm going to make a few assumptions. Number 1, he was probably IFR. And if you were to send around a VFR airplane or an IFR airplane, those are 2 wildly different things with how they have to be treated on the go. I don't know if he was on a straight-in ILS. I don't know if he was on a visual approach or what. But again, those bits of information, if I had them, would definitely help me out here. But chances are, if you're just going to send around the IFR airplane, now a whole bunch more things have to get done. Whereas if you just send around the VFR light sport guy in front, well, let's be honest, a whole lot less things have to be done. You send them around and then that's it. Now, that's probably what happened. Unfortunately, though, I understand you were if you say you're basically in the landing flare, now that's a critical phase of flight. So as controllers, we don't really want to mess with you or talk to you even at all. It says that right in the book during a critical phase of flight. Landing flare definitely counts. Unfortunately, though, not everything always goes exactly according to plan. And at airports like that and like mine, there's a lot of kind of gray area because the performance characteristics of airplanes, even of the same category like we just discussed a second ago, can be wildly different. And then the rules under which they're flying, wildly different. You go to somewhere like, any big class Bravo airport. I'm not saying that it's easy. It's not. But you do have very similar versus dissimilar types of aircraft, professional crews, similar speeds, things like that. So I guess the order part of it kind of falls into place a little better. So before I start rambling here, I'm going to say that for some reason, the controller made the decision that you're going to go around, not the Meridian, which is kind of a huge bummer. I'd like to think that we don't ever let it get to that point where you've got to make kind of a tough call like that. But again, sometimes it just happens. Now, what your CFI said, I'm not sure, but you know how you can get an answer is actually just ask them. I mean, it's actually fair game after something like that to just ask, hey, what was the reason for our go around there? Or you could call on the phone and have that conversation offline, which is probably better anyway. So I guess the tired point I'm trying to make is there's not always a direct reason like for everything. And unfortunately, when it comes down to a judgment call, someone's probably not going to be too happy with the outcome. But if you're not, really just make sure to call the tower and ask. I mean, it's completely valid question. And on top of that too, to the point of your PIC authority, if somebody's asked you to do something that compromises the safety of your flight, you are the PIC and you can be like, no, I'm not going to do that. Now, that being said, if you are able to comply with the clearance, even if you don't really like it, you should probably do so. But again, you're the PIC. So if your judgment says that is just straight up unsafe and I'm not going to do it, well, I mean, that's your call. And if you get a number, you got to do paperwork on it. You can just say, hey, that's what happened. Anyway, I hope that helps you. And with the information I got, that's probably about the best answer I can give. But hey, shoot me an email if that wasn't enough, and maybe we can get into a little bit further. Now, this next little bit here is kind of a treat because it's not only listener feedback, but it's actually going to lead us to an article from Airfax, like I said at the very beginning. And it's a really, really good one, and that's how we're going to finish out this show. So don't go anywhere. The feedback's from a man named Elliott Cox, and he's a new patron of the show, a very generous one at that, so welcome and thank you very much. And he says, hey, Brandon, it's been a while. I'm getting caught up on my podcast, and I just finished up episode 83. What a great episode. I loved your conversation with Pam. The subject of active listening really made me smile because that was a really big part of the training I received throughout all of my ratings. And I was fortunate enough to have an excellent instructor who was really good at not letting me slack on my communication skills. His name is Ron Horton, and he teaches at Arrowwood Aviation in Monroe, North Carolina, EQY. But you may know him from his Opposing Bases episodes. That was 145, Lifelong Commitment to Aviation, October 5th and 9th. And he's also a patron of this show, by the way. So yeah, I know him quite well. A great guy. Ron is a stickler for clear communication and precise flying, and I'm grateful to him for that, because if I could have slacked during training, well, I would have. He once told me during a practice approach when I goofed up a readback, quote, you talk on the radio fine. You just need to learn to listen faster. Anyway, I could go on with Ron's stories, but I digress. I remember one time in particular when I had to fess up to an approach controller on my second solo cross country. I was about 20 miles from GMU, which is Greenville downtown, Greenville, South Carolina, and the controller gave me direct JUD key. At the time, I had no idea what that meant, so I fessed up and I said, you know what, I'm a student pilot, and I have no idea what you just asked me to do. The controller stifled a chuckle, and then he brought me around on vectors for one of the worst landings of my flying career. But that's a different story. Actually, it's the same story. It's published at Airfax, and we're going to read it, don't worry. But all that groundwork that Ron laid, especially communications and precise flying, have served me well over the past several years because I just finished up the training and check ride for my Falcon 900LX PIC type rating, and I don't think I would have done as well with a journey here if it weren't for an excellent instructor. That's a lot of rambling to say that I think you and Pam hit the nail on the head. A little bit of kindness and support can go a long way in helping to encourage someone to keep at it even when the going gets tough. Hell, especially when the going gets tough. If someone's having a particularly bad day, or has maybe hit a plateau in their training, one grumpy controller, or for that matter CFI or mechanic, could be the straw that breaks the camel's back. And on the flip side, a pat on the back and a well done could build up enough steam to get someone to push through that slump and back on track to get the job done. All right, well, enough of me already. I love the work you do, and thanks for sharing all these great conversations with us, Elliott. Yeah, that episode I did with Pam is probably one of my all-time favorites. She is the definition of great people and also the definition of great controllers. Really the whole package. And I'm really glad that you and so many others have not just enjoyed it, but written me to tell me why. And everyone gets a little something different out of it. And that's perfect. And I tell you what, that really is the essence of why I do this show. And a fun little side note, actually, she may be getting put up for a larger sharing of her story in a large publication that you've probably heard of. And if that does happen, I will be sure to tell you all when and where that is. But until then, we're definitely going to read your story, Elliott, because it's really, really, really good. And in the same vein as sharing this information like I do here, you've picked up a pen, or rather pulled up a keyboard, and done exactly the same thing. So I salute you for that as well. Elliott's article comes from airfaxjournal.com. Again, something you should definitely like and subscribe to. It was founded by the late Dick Collins, one of my all-time favorite writers, and his article was published on August 22nd, 2019. It's called Feeling Helpless on My Second Solo Cross Country by Elliott Cox. My first solo cross country was mostly uneventful. My instructor flew the route with me on a Monday, and then the following Friday I flew it solo after my navlog and flight planning were blessed. It was a thrilling flight because I was out of the 25-mile student zone, and I was solo. My first airport was a small class Delta, FLO, south of my home airport, which is EQY. I got flight following as soon as I was on my way. Although the radio work was intimidating, I practiced each call before I keyed the mic, and then I tried to anticipate the next call, so I wouldn't stammer. After a decent landing, I told the tower that I wanted to taxi back to the end of the runway, depart VFR to the northeast, and yes, please, I'd like flight following. I got going from runway 27 and made a right turn out over the city of Florence, South Carolina, toward my next airport, Laurinburg-Maxton, Mike Echo Bravo. This is where the confidence set in. I climbed to 3,500 feet, had the nav set and centered, marked off the checkpoints, and the timing was working out. I knew exactly where I was. By gum, this pilot thing may work out yet. I made it over to Mike Echo Bravo and made an okay landing. I called CTAF and announced that I was taxiing back to the runway for a VFR departure to the southwest. I got going from runway 23 and departed straight out toward the next airport, Bravo Bravo Pop, which is only 21 miles away. Eventually, I saw the airport and I entered the traffic pattern. I was a bit off my game due to the short flight, so I was a bit further behind the airplane than I allowed myself to realize. When I turned final, I knew I was fast, but I didn't do anything to fix it. I dumped full flaps. I got it slowed a little bit, but as I crossed the 1,000-footers, I was still flying at around 90 knots. I tried to put it down, but I ended up skipping across the runway like a dumb stone across a lake, and that stone knew better. I set the throttle to full power, and I went around. And even after everything I've read and all the sage advice from veteran pilots, including my instructor, I felt a bit of a ding in my pride at having to go around. So I fought the urge to just call it a landing, head homeward, and tuck my tail in between my legs. Instead, though, I made another circuit in the pattern and I landed uneventfully. It's funny how the runway gets bigger when you're flying slower. The leg back home to EQY was an easy one. I kept the river off my left wing to Highway 74, and then I followed that west all the way home. All that was left for me was to bask in the relief and satisfaction of successfully completing my first cross country. Great, my instructor said. We'll call him Ron, because that's his name. You need a little more solo cross country time, so go do another one. Damn, didn't see that one coming. He went on, though. Quote, and this time, go to at least one airport you've never been to before, and make it a towered field. End quote. What's that word for being excited and scared at the same time? Anxious. Yeah, that's what I was. 6 days later, I was off again. I flew the first leg down to FLO because I needed more towered field experience, and I was familiar with the route from FLO. I headed northwest towards Greenville downtown, Golf Mike uniform. I was keeping I-20 off my left wing when Shaw Approach asked me to deviate 30 degrees to the left because they were throwing people out of airplanes over Camden. Yet another reason to always get flight following when flying VFR. Camden, CDN, isn't marked as a meat missile airport, yet there they were. I kept my eyes out for chutes, but I never saw any. My flight planning was fairly simple. I was following I-20 west out of Florence for about 50 miles over the south side of Lake Monticello, then I-26 west to I-385, right into GMU. I had checkpoints along the way that made it virtually impossible for me to get lost. I made my way across the lake, and instead of spotting the I-385 loop, Greer Approach said November 55 Echo, gear red type. I heard my tail number, but the words that came after it, they didn't make any sense. I keyed the mic. Greer Approach, 55 Echo, could you please repeat? November 55 Echo, clear direct, gobbledygook. A couple of things went through my mind at this point. First and foremost, I didn't want to sound ignorant and inexperienced, like a student pilot. But I also didn't want to die, and I didn't want to make the nightly news. I decided pretty quickly that my pride was worth far less than my desire to have a successful cross-country. I breathed deeply, keyed the mic, and said, Greer Approach, Skyhawk 2055 Echo, I'm a student pilot, and I have no idea what you just asked me to do. Obviously stifling a chuckle, I heard back November 55 Echo, Roger. Fly heading 330, descend to maintain 3000. I figured out later that what he was telling me is that I was cleared direct Judd key, which is the initial approach fix for the ILS Zulu runway 1. I could easily make that happen now, but at the time I was barely able to use the GPS to go direct to an airport. I set my heading for 330 and descended to 3000. The wind was a little gustier than I had planned, and there were a few more clouds around than I was anticipating, and the approach controller, he was pretty busy. And I was a little distracted by trying to keep the Donaldson Airport off my left wing, and I needed to enrich in the mixture, and I did run the checklist. And where did he say the traffic was? And, well, task saturation is very easily reached as a student pilot, and it's sometimes difficult to recognize. I was on a long final for runway 1, and I realized I never got the ATIS. I switched over to the ATIS frequency, wrote it all down, and then back on the approach, they called me and told me something. I don't remember what it was, but I read it back. They advised me to contact the tower, so I did. And tower said, clear to land runway 1. Wind is something across the runway, gusting to more across the runway. Ugh, that wasn't in the TAF. Clear to land, 1-5 Echo. I was on short final and bucking around like crazy while trying to hold the center line. My hands were sweating and I felt like I was just along for the ride. I made it over the numbers and was doing a decent job of tracking the center line. I put the mains down and I must have neutralized the ailerons or something because the plane felt like a leaf in a fall breeze and bounded towards the left side of the runway with gusto. I cranked the ailerons to the right, and I may or may not have used rudder and or brakes to correct to the right. I don't remember. But what I do remember vividly is a runway edge light passing under my wing and thankfully outside of the range of my left main gear, but only just. I was skidding sideways and had no control at all. Being helpless sucks. Let me rephrase that. Feeling helpless sucks. I certainly wasn't helpless, only inexperienced and behind the airplane. I got the airplane under control and back to centerline. The taxi to the ramp's a bit blurry. I remember taking the wrong taxiway or intersection and ground having to help me out a bit. I taxied to the runway cafe on the field and I shut down. I sat down, still a bit rattled, and ate lunch. As I was finishing up, I was still shaking my head at the memory of almost taking out a few lights. The realization hit me that I had to fly myself home too, so I needed to get my head right. And I analyzed what went wrong, but more importantly, what went right. I convinced myself that, yes, the crosswind approach and landing could have or should have been better. And when I realized I was nothing more than a solo passenger on a bad approach, I should have initiated a go-around and told the tower that I want to try again. Instead, I fell victim to some of the classic traps. I continued an approach that I knew wasn't stable, and I told myself that everything would work out. And thankfully, everything did work out this time. But next time, it might not. After I finished lunch and felt that I was in the right frame of mind, I sat in the airplane for a few minutes before turning the master switch on. I wanted to make sure, really sure, that I wasn't going to kill myself as I was headed home. I may have made a bad judgment call, but that didn't make me a bad pilot. I started the engine and set everything up. I was holding short at the end of the runway, running the checklist one more time. Look left, look right, take a deep breath, chin up, key the mic. Greenville Tower, Skyhawk 5-5 Echo, holding short runway 1, ready for departure. And I was. The flight home was utterly and blissfully uneventful. Elliott's an A&P with an IA, and he's the director of maintenance for a Charlotte, North Carolina-based corporate flight department. He's a husband, a father of 4, and an instrument-rated commercial pilot. And I'm going to add to that, a great writer too. And again, I don't always do this, but just because it's Ron Horton, the first comment on the article is another great piece of writing. It's not just that you put the words together so nicely, but that you make us feel as though we were in the cockpit with you. Many student pilots felt the same anxieties, and a lot of us are nodding our heads saying, yep, that was me too. So Elliott, thank you so much, not only for writing this wonderful article, but for sending in your feedback to the show, and even more importantly, supporting the show. Thank you so much. And if Elliott and Ron or anybody else that's written in today has inspired you, I'd love to hear about it. You can go to Podcasting on a Plane, use your smartphone or the SpeakPipe widget that pops up on the website and record me something, and who knows, maybe it'll end up on the show, just like today. And while you're there, you could be just like Elliott or Ron or Daniel or any of the others and support the show too. I'd really appreciate having you on board as a patron. You get episodes early and sometimes other fun stuff too. If you're not into the recurring thing, you could head over to buymeacoffee.com/Bravo Golf spelled out and do a one-time thing in increments of just $3, or there's also a PayPal link there too. If you want to stay sharp on the mic, make sure to use the affiliate code DELTA at plainenglishsim.com to get 10% off the best smartphone-based ATC comm simulator around. There's, of course, a link in the show notes. And as always, I thank you so much for your support in whatever form it takes and for listening to the show and passing the word along about this or any of your favorite aviation podcasts to a friend. Now, as you go, make sure you're subscribed to Airfax Journal and please read Elliott's article and so many other great ones there as well, especially the backlog from Dick Collins, always a favorite pastime of mine. That's all for now. Your frequency change is approved until next time, and report back on this frequency for the next episode. Good day.
Podcasting on a Plane podcast is presented for entertainment purposes only. Brandon's comments and those of his guests, the website's content, and any of the social media, etc., are not part of his official responsibility as a controller or as an FAA employee. The views and opinions you hear on the podcast are his, and those of his guests, and not necessarily that of the FAA. Also, while he's a CFI, he's not acting as your CFI, nor is he your mechanic, your doctor, your shrink, or your spouse. This podcast is presented for entertainment, camaraderie and fun, but is in no way, shape or form professional advice or legal counsel. If you're in need of professional advice, get some from somewhere more appropriate than a podcast, no matter how good this one may be.